to join you today to speak. I'm going to focus on irrigation, nutrition, and harvest prep as we get started with coming into the very, very beginning of hull split here in 1st of July. So topics for today. Let's see. I'm going to okay, we're going to talk about, as I said, irrigation, a little bit about nutrition, more about irrigation and harvest prep, but practices around harvest. Mostly, I suspect this review, except for some of the irrigation stuff, which I learned in prep for this. I've picked up some more information that's good for me. So here we go. Pardon me, I've gone too far. All right. There we go. Nutrition briefly, really focused on nitrogen, potassium, zinc, and boron are the four of the more than a dozen micronutrients, essential nutrients that almonds are particularly in need of in mature, well-producing orchards. Really focused today though on nitrogen and potassium because the micros are best taken care of or can be well taken care of at other times of the year. So here we are at the July 1st. Nitrogen, which is critical to adequate nitrogen nutrition, which is critical to your economically sustainable, to good crops, basically, is really this time of year. It only adds to tree vigor, which might hurt removal at harvest. So no real need for no need for nitrogen whatsoever at this time of the year. As we come in between now and to pick up. The reason for that is shown here. This on the left there, you've got nitrogen, pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 pounds of crop. You can see there's quite a bit in there, up to 80 pounds per 1,000 pounds of crop. Well, pardon me, actually, the axis goes that high. It's only about 60, maybe a little bit higher than 60. But the point being, this is accumulation days after full bloom. Once you get to end of June, once you get to July, things are fairly flat. There's maybe a little bit of it's not significant decrease, but the point being, the nuts are not picking up any nitrogen through July. Whereas for the same time period for potassium, you've got continued accumulation of potassium in the nuts, and so there's an opportunity to catch up on potassium if and potassium doesn't affect vigor like nitrogen does. So if you take a leaf sample, if you took it in June or you take it early in July right now, and you have the results in front of you, and you are close to being short on potassium, which will hurt. If you're deficient in potassium right now, it'll hurt your spur health and it'll hurt your flower numbers for next year. So there's a little tiny window right now to get some more potassium in the orchard. And I think my next slide talks about that. Yeah, you don't want to be below 1% leaf K. That's officially deficient. The sufficient level is 1.4, but all the research I've seen it is done on individual trees. But when a tree gets below 1%, you're going to lose yield the next year, in that there are some spurs in that tree that are not going to return to full health, and they're not going to set flowers next year. So particularly in a year like this where you've got big crops, seems like I'm hearing big crops everywhere. There's certainly big crops in the lower Sacramento Valley where I work. So your crops can use a lot. Big crops can use a lot of potassium. Pardon me. An early July check. Hopefully you've been a little bit ahead of this, but an early July check can tell you if you're approaching deficient, how big an issue it is. So if your June or July levels are low, a little bit of, you don't have to put a huge amount on, but a little bit of fertigated potassium, it's not a little bit, but it's certainly not the full amount you put on in a year, should be enough to avoid deficiency. Fertigated materials are more expensive, so plugging the gap right now with a shot of fertigation material would allow you to set you up for your program in the fall, which could include banding or mini bands of dry material, which are less costly per ton. So that really covers most of the nutrition that I want to talk about. Nitrogen is finished until the nuts come up, picked up, and even then, depending upon your situation, well, I may step back. In a year like this with a big crop, look very carefully at your summer leaf levels, and you may, if they're deficient or touching on deficient, you might add a little bit of nitrogen in the fall. But if you've been knowing you've got a big crop, if you've been keeping up all season long, you probably don't need some come the fall, and based on my experience and research. So big topic for conversation for the presentation right now is irrigation, critical to tree health and particularly to economic production here as we come into harvest on a number of levels. Just as a reminder, this is bi-weekly water use in almonds. So, early in the season, less leaves, not as warm. You ramp up as summer comes on, canopy fills up, and by, here we are, July 1st, and we get moving into the second half of the month. You're using about 2 inches a week. This is bi-weekly, so it says 4, but don't worry about the RDI numbers here. I primarily put the slide here to show you that the amount of water for full ET that the crop's using right now is significant. And that's important because water deficiency, significant water stress right now is going to cost you money in smaller kernels, but running too much water late in the season can delay maturity, can make the trees harder to shake. You end up with some stick tights. Too much or too little water can create stick tight problems. So careful irrigation practices from hull split to shake are really critical to the outcome and the economics of the season. Just a bit of a review. The kernel is what you get paid for, and that's the embryo dry weight down here. So everything else happens. You get the length of the hull is established early. The seed length is established early. Embryo length, which is kernel fill, is essentially finished by July 1st. But the dry weight of the embryo that you get paid for really accumulates and really is made as in the last 2 months, but a little bit in June, but certainly in July, and then tailing off. By the first week of August, even though this looks like it comes up a little bit, you're pretty much finished by the end of the first week of August as far as kernel dry weight goes. But point being, July is a critical time for dry weight accumulation in the embryo, and irrigation, not any other inputs, is really the most important factor in that, in making the best dry weight you can. This information came from the UCA and our UC's Almond Production Manual from a few years back. It's a few years back, but that information hasn't changed. Here's what kernel fill looks like. By May is kernel fill, when the huge amount of nitrogen gets in the kernel, but the dry weight, the fats and the starches that probably mostly the fats that accumulate in the kernel that what you're getting paid for occurs after kernel fills and the fats accumulate. So it's funny, that's the last thing that happens is kernel dry weight, and that's your bottom line. So just a bit of a review. The kernels are going to gain dry weight all the way up to hull split, and this is data again from the Almond Production Manual. This is of course the axis here starts you at almost a gram per kernel weight. So the second half of July is when you get it's about 20% increase in kernel growth, and that's a 1.15 grams per kernel is about a 25 count nut, And down here, you're looking at about a 30 count nut. Right here, there is the end of that first week of August is where you're getting to, if all the nuts in the tree, if the least split nuts in the tree look like this, you're at full maturity. The actual average is going to be flat through here. So the critical point here is this is a huge amount of growth here. 20% of the total weight can be accumulating here, and that's coming right into harvest. It's a critical time for production and income. So, and this is a slide from David Dahl, the Almond Doctor, from that particular post, the post of last summer. His point being that your grams per kernel, again here, somewhere this is around a 25 count. We're down here at 30. This is your stem water potential. This is the pressure chamber reading. The less negative is the less stressed. The more stressed is down here on the more negative numbers. And you can see that the least stressed nuts through the July-June average number of about 13, probably of 10 bars, or down here to 13, 14, maybe even 15. You're at better size than if you're looking at below 15, minus 15 bars. And David's point basically is if you average through that June-July period, if you're under 15 bars, you're leaving money on the table because your nuts are not as big. You're gonna have some shrivel. You're just not getting the photosynthesis is not occurring at the level it could if you were fully irrigated or running a little stress. But this is significant stress down here. You get in this area 18 bars and less, you're starting to see wilt and maybe some leaf loss. You can leave money on the table with insufficient with insufficient nitrogen, insufficient water in the dead of summer, June, July. So an overall irrigation strategy is minus 15 bars for just a couple of weeks, maybe 3, but 2 to 3 weeks at a hull split to manage hull rot. More uniform moisture throughout the orchard. This practice is a significant tool to manage hull rot. And once you've got 90% hull split and you get past that period, you're looking at, based on this year, another second week of July, tail end of the second week of July, you come back to full ET after you've got the nuts are split, not ready to shake, but split. And those turgid, the adequate moisture keeps the hulls moisture in them, and that allows them to give you a full split and get away from stick tights, because water stress throughout the entire July is going to leave you with significant water stress. Under 15 bars, you're going to have smaller nuts, and you're also going to could have some issues with stick tights. So your irrigation cutoff just before harvest to get harvesters in and reduce, to some degree, reduce barking. Less vigorous trees are going to hold the nuts, not hold the nuts as tightly. The more vigor you have in a tree, the longer it's going to be delays maturity. And across the orchard, if you have some trees that are wetter than others, that's going to affect your shake, how clean they shake, and sometimes how hard the operator is going to work to clean them up, and that means barking. And then as soon as you get the nuts away from the irrigation water after harvest, back to full ET, because some growers more and more, I think, are moving nuts to allow irrigation while they're drying. Can't get irrigation water on the drying nuts, but you can move them to the half the orchard or floor or lesser and run drip on either side, so you can keep the trees wet and allow the nuts to dry. Especially some growers will send the conditioner through and have a wide flat drying space in the middle of the rows, and they're running double line drips on either side. I know a big grower in the Arbuckle area who's moving all his orchards to double line drip because of harvest management, irrigation management issues. And then the critical nature of post-harvest, of adequate post-harvest irrigation. You don't need nearly as much as you do in mid-season per that curve I showed you earlier. You get through August and you're starting to tail off a little bit on water use, just based on the day length and the crop's gone, things of that nature. But that water is critically important to bud development for next year. So not excessive water, but adequate moisture in orchards is critical to next year's crop. So one of the things that David Dahl's talked about, and I think growers that he works with and had worked with, at least in the Modesto, Merced area, we're looking at sort of reducing the orchard, the deep water, the water bank, and moving to sort of a just-in-time irrigation program in order to have more flexibility for harvest timing and whole rot management. And I like the idea of driving hard up to a stop sign, then jamming on the brakes. You're still waiting at the stop sign, and a stop sign's coming. The analogy with it's a less efficient way to drive, and the analogy in orchards is harvest is coming. You're going to need to be able to dry down the orchard and get equipment in and not bark trees. Keeping adequate moisture while drying down the water bank allows you to get to harvest or get to harvestability and orchard access quickly when it's time to go. So I'm using these analogies, but pumping the brakes, just slowing things down, and gives you a better handling orchard instead of being ready to shake, but the trees are too green because there's deep water. You may have turned off the water, but the trees have access to deep water. They're not going to dry down as quickly, and they won't be as ready to shake. And maybe you have more worm pressure. Maybe you'll have to pass that block up, or you'll bark some trees and have to pull out. You're more nimble when you're giving the trees just the water they need at any one time. You have to have the ability to. I'll run through this. It's not for everyone, but something to think about. Here's some of the reasons why it's not for everyone. Can your irrigation system deliver maximum crop water needs? If you let the water bank dry up, you have to be able to give the trees everything they need for 100% ET on any given day. So that's not everybody has that ability. Also, how are you managing? How do you know what's too much? We talked about insufficient water, extreme or significant water stress can hurt your yield. You need to be able to know when you're getting towards that point. Also some growers don't. If you're on an irrigation district that only delivers water on certain days, you're not in control of your water deliveries. I recognize this. What I'm talking about here is not really feasible for you, because if you're irrigating the trees as they need it, you may not be getting that water as the district, based on the district's delivery. So pump the brakes. This is the program that David talked about, and some of the growers in his area, the Merced, they start drying down in mid-June, cutting back on ET, and when they hit 15 bars, they go back to full ET. That has dried, the water sources, the soil moisture is dried down to the point you're just spoon feeding the trees with water. And you get your 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks during early hull split to help manage the hull rot, then back up to full ET to assure good split, good hullability. And then with no water bank, you can dry down in just a few days. Now, a lot of this is going to depend upon your soil texture, irrigation systems, how much water you wet with each irrigation. But this is an interesting approach that I put out there. It gives you more control over the orchard. If it's time if the shaker comes available on a custom job early and help you get rid of worms, or help you beat the worms, having this kind of flexibility will allow you to get the machines in there. All right, let's see. not getting, here we go. So that's my run through on irrigation. Critical, too much is going to leave you risking barking and a little bit delayed harvest, maybe some stick tight issues that are just too much and they're not mature when it comes times to shake in some parts of the orchard. Not enough, significantly not enough, is also could lead to yield loss and shrivel, and also some stick tights if you're getting extreme drying, under 15 bars on average. So harvest floor prep, the traditional approach has been glyphosate or Roundup and all the generics, followed by a close mow. Depending upon your irrigation system, you can get regrowth of grass, some grasses and other weeds as the season, as you come into pollinizer harvests. That can be an issue. One of the problems potentially facing the industry now is the European Union's concern with glyphosate. That's a huge, mature, strong market, and I know some growers have opted to go away from glyphosate. They're looking at alternative burn down chemistries for trunk to trunk spraying, like Gramoxone, glufosinate. I realize that those products have their own issues, but if the market doesn't want glyphosate and a clean, smooth orchard floor is important to the harvestability, trash issues, things of that nature. These are options that are not glyphosate. I know some other growers are looking at propane or other heat sources to kill weeds in the orchard floor, and all these are followed by close mow. It's a short, all really glyphosate through these other alternative materials and practices are all knockdown practices. They don't control sprouting of new weeds once your irrigation between the nons and pollinizers comes on, but they are effective particularly for non-pareil harvest. Something that's been tried in the past and is intriguing but has its issues is a light rate of pre-emergent herbicide, again in blocks where you can incorporate with sprinklers. Work that Joe Connell did years ago in almonds using a quart of surfland of the acre, which doesn't last through the fall, provided adequate control of things like jungle rice, which are glyphosate resistant. I'm told that surflands, there's not very much in the market. The cost is such that it's not being manufactured. If you have some, the label does give you the ability to use it, but it's worth, depending upon the germination timing of some of your weeds, it's a consideration, but again, the availability, I'm told, is limited. Pendimethalin Prowl has a 60-day PHI, and that ship is probably sailed based on mid-August harvest date. There are other pre-emergent herbicides out there that have pretty short pre-harvest intervals. I'm not aware of any research that looks at them, so I'm bringing it up for consideration, but I would be very, very careful or in considering any of that. But it does allow you to control with a low rate, does give you the opportunity to control re-sprouting of grasses between, say, in full coverage blocks or partial cover blocks with micros between, say, non-pareil harvest and your pollinizers. So a major concern at harvest time is barking, which allows can be infested. The bark damage from shakers can be a site of entry of ceratocystis, and ceratocystis is the way you can tell if it's ceratocystis versus Phytophthora. In ceratocystis, at the margin of the canker, which is hidden by the bark here, is where you see the gumming. With Phytophthora, the gumballs will be throughout the infection area. But this is ceratocystis in almond. this is a tree that's has got the damage here, and it's some of the scaffolds are being girdled. So I would have bet that many of us are aware of orchards that have been severely damaged by barking, which is a combination of inappropriate timing and then bad or poor management. Because once you start to see splitting, once you start to see damage, you should be getting out of there. Getting the shaker out of there. Okay, this is, I apologize for the racket. This is the Almond Doctor's Guide to Reducing Trunk Shaker Damage. Time your harvest to reduce the force needed for nut removal. The drier the nuts, the less weight they have. They may not come off as quickly. So the earlier you, once you get 100% hull split, is the time to get best removal, particularly in those varieties that like Padre and Winters, Independence, that can be difficult to shake. And this is once all the trees, all the nuts in the tree look, and in the orchard, at least look like this. This would probably be at the bottom of the tree, so at the top you'd have quite a bit of hull drying going on. You're ready to shake. And I've talked to Joe Connell. Joe thinks that if you can squeeze the tips and they pop, then you're ready. You're ready to go. But that stage is not too far from this one. Over irrigation allows, especially in rolling terrain, can allow some areas to become very wet, more vigorous. And so that means slow to mature nuts. And an operator could shake harder on those trees because the nuts aren't coming off, and you can end up with damage. So also lower July leaf nitrogen levels, again, limit vigorousness, the vigor of the tree, and hull removal or nut removal. Excessive vigor delays maturity, trees are harder to shake. And make sure and manage and watch your shaker operators so that they're doing a good job shaking trees. Walking behind an operator is a great way of reminding them that you're paying attention. And you can, if they're listening to you and they're doing their best and it's still too wet and the nuts aren't coming off, you've got to move them out of there, even if you want to, the timing is right. And if they're not listening to you and still trees are getting damaged, they need to do something else. So that's somebody who's got skin in the game in the orchard when the machines are going on a regular basis is really important to the health of the orchard. And finally, the younger blocks that have bark strength issues, or where the risk of barking is going to mean more damage, and bark strength is going to increase through the season. So save your younger blocks for last, if at all possible. They also shouldn't have as much volume. So moving on. Okay, bottom line, it's not necessarily water status that determines whether you're going to get trees barked or not. It's not just about water cutoff timing. If you've got a situation in your orchard where you've got variability in maturity, and the harder and longer trees are shaken to get clearance, the greater your risk of trunk damage. So a uniform maturity, nuts with a little greener, so they are heavier and will give more energy, get more energy from the shake, is going to make a bigger difference in trunk damage than just looking at water cutoff timing. And there is no, to my knowledge, no stem water potential number that guarantees you lack of damage, lack of trunk damage. Less vigorous orchards with good management at harvest time is what's going to give you the least amount of damage. Shaking just below the scaffold, if you have nice tall trunks, getting the angling up the shaker head and putting it right below the crotch will give you more shake to the top of the tree, to the nuts. Whereas if you have it more horizontal and just above the top of the soil there, or at least on the top of the berm, you're going to have more root damage, you're going to lose more of your shake energy to the roots than you will the top of the tree. So this operator is moving down this is a third leaf orchard, and he's working just, has the head angled up, and it's just relatively close to the scaffolds. He's not brushing up against them with the head, but he's getting better shake with that kind of an angle. Dust is a major issue for California almond production. I've talked to a number of growers who know that dust isn't helpful. It's a hull rot issue. It moves aerial Phytophthora up into the trees, or we've seen aerial Phytophthora outbreaks in pollinator varieties, following early fall rains, or that where the weight of, if you still have a pollinator with nuts in the tree and it rains, the dust from your nonpareil harvest can get moved down into the bowl there between where the scaffolds come together. And I've seen orchards where there's been aerial Phytophthora infections, and that's the best explanation we can have as to how it happens, and that's transferred there by dust. So minimizing dust movement, it's good for the orchard. Nobody likes to walk around in it, and also it's a safety issue outside of the orchard, air quality as well as driving safety, neighbors, things of that nature. So dust management is important, as we said. First of all, do your employees know, you can't always be out there, do your employees know that you want as little dust as possible at harvest? They know that you want a clean orchard, nuts shaken off carefully, carefully swept, but do they know that that dust management is important to you? You want to point your sweeper blowers into the orchard from the field edges, especially in your roads and neighbors, so you're not pushing that dust actively out onto roads and into neighbors' fields and backyards. Set your sweeper brushes just above, or maybe no more than a half an inch, but at or just above the orchard floor. Gets the nuts moved, and you're not digging up dirt as the sweepers are moving along, and digging up dirt and rolling the nuts in it, and then as you sweep, putting all that dust and dirt into the windrow that's going to get kicked out when the pickup machine comes through. Wherever possible, low dust machine. I know most of the models on the market right now are much better at reducing dust than they were, several decades ago, but that's an important consideration. And then the more slowly you drive the pickup machine near road, the less dust you produce. And I realize time is money, and it's a big crop this year, but there are certain places where on the edges of the property, roads and neighbors, the same thing with spraying, you just are a heightened awareness of off-farm movement of spray and of dust when you're near sites where the material can move and be a nuisance. And quite frankly, a health risk. I imagine anybody that works in almonds has slowed down on a road as a pickup machine or a sweeper kicks up a bunch of dust onto the road. So finally, or where feasible, in young blocks, less vigorous trees that the catch frame fits around, consider catch frame harvesting to eliminate sweeping and reduce dust. I don't know how many units are out there, but I know a number of operators in the North Valley that certainly do young orchards on a regular basis, where the canopies are caught easily by the catch frame. In this particular block, it worked fairly well, although we did have the sweeper behind it to catch any nuts that got lost. It wasn't throwing up that much dust. Things to consider. Anyhow, that's the bulk of the information I have. I can take some questions. I'll, as Tom pointed out, I'll be with you through the remainder of the program.